Sadly, I think we always live in times of both crisis and possibility, but I think we're of this pandemic. And at the same time, as Jews, we remain painfully aware of the rising anti-Semitism in our midst. I think it was just last week that the ADL came out with its 2019 report, recording over 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, the highest number since the ADL started the audit. Frankly, as an American Jewish historian, I never thought that I would witness this upsurge in anti-Semitism in my lifetime, a mere 75 years after the Shoah. And our concerns about both the pandemic and anti-Semitism are exacerbated by the relentless political disinformation campaign, the fake news of the title, that threatens our democracy. It's even more disturbing, and that's what we'll focus on today when we consider how the two are related. Looking just around with the rhetoric around the coronavirus, we've seen reports, tweets, clips where Jews or Israel are accused of manufacturing or spreading the coronavirus to advance global control, or Jews who are reported to be making money off the virus by exploiting market volatility through loans, by spreading lies about the hoax coronavirus so that people will rush to get vaccinated, again with the implication that Jews will profit from such practices. And these images are often accompanied by photos of the billionaire philanthropist George Soros. Tropes like this build upon the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which many of you know is a fabricated document first circulated in the early 20th century that promoted the conspiracy theory that Jews are plotting to control the world. Fake news then is not new, and the essential role that it plays in fomenting anti-Semitism dates back to ancient times. So what I would like to do today is examine the roots of anti-Semitism. We will focus in the first part of today's class on the origins of Christian anti-Semitism. We will then look at the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. We will move fairly quickly through modernity and focus a little bit on the extent to which American anti-Semitism is distinctive or not. And then we will bring it back to the present times, where hopefully we'll focus less on the crisis and more on the possibilities of what how we might think about this whole question of fake news and anti-Semitism as we look forward. So, beginning with the origins of Christianity and the origins of Judaism. Today, we think of Jews and Christians as belonging to separate traditions, with historical linkage, shared texts, and some shared ethical foundations. But it was not always so, especially in the first two-thirds of the Common Era. Two-thirds of the first century of the Common Era. Two traditions, what became Rabbinic Judaism and what became Christianity, emerged out of biblical Israel. Not surprisingly, there were various interpretations of how Torah was to be lived. Not surprisingly, that led to tension and hostility between groups who each had their own way of interpreting Torah, and each believed that it ought to be observed in the way that they understood it to be. Moreover, in the world of antiquity, without the obvious, television, internet, and many other ways in which our lives are distracted, intellectual sparring was a sport. Teachers had their students, and arguments against other schools of thought could sometimes include vilifying one's opponents. We know this instinctively. What bothers us most? The people that differ with us in small, discrete, but crucial ways. These are the ideas that we feel motivated to disparage, to prove wrong, in a way to differentiate ourselves from something that seems so close, and to give ourselves a sense of confidence in what we believe. So, if we think about Christianity as emerging over the period of several centuries from what becomes Rabbinic Judaism, it gives us a lens through which we can look at the book of Matthew. And if you will look at your first source, that's what I'd like us to take a look at that now. You can see the first source is a selection from the 6th chapter of Matthew. I chose it because it is read annually on Ash Wednesday, when Catholic churches are nearly as crowded as they are on Christmas. So this would be a text that Christians would know well. I'm gonna read selections, and I hope you'll follow along. Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. When you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Verse 5, and when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. 16, and whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces to show others that they are fasting. What is it that we are seeing here when we look at this text? What would your takeaway be from hearing this if you were sitting in church every year? Let's look first at what was this text? Who was Matthew? What kind of argument is this? Who is Matthew criticizing? Most likely, Matthew, a Jew, was criticizing other Jews in the way that some of us Jews might criticize other Jews. Don't be such a show-off. You're such a hypocrite. You only pray when other people see you praying. I could see myself saying that to someone, and that's what's going on here. These are Jews, maybe Pharisees in the first century, trying to figure out what it means to be Jewish. What is the most pious way to be? What is the truest way to be a Jew? And so you have Jews criticizing others. Those of you that are familiar with Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, you might find some of the passages in the Ethics of the Fathers resonating in this document. Avot, chapter 1, verse 3 says, don't do a mitzvah just to get a reward. That's similar to what you're hearing in this rhetoric here. If you look at the 3 selections I had here, one is verse 2 is talking about tzedakah, verse 5 is talking about tefillah, verse 16 is talking about tshuva. If you have your ears attuned to what we say on Yom Kippur, what are the 3 things that we are trying to do before God on the holiest day of the year to minimize whatever we may be punished for what we might have, in the ways in which we might have fallen short during the year? These 3 things: charity, tzedakah, prayer, tefillah, tshuva, through fasting. So in many ways, what you're seeing here is the intra-Jewish argument going on here. And what happens If you now look at chapter 23, and I won't read it all here with you, but you will notice that each verse is a critique of you Pharisees, you hypocrites, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. Over and over again, this trope gets repeated so that someone sitting, listening in the early church to this rhetoric would make a very simple and easy equation. Jew equals hypocrite equals Pharisee. And one of the ways that the early followers of Jesus began to differentiate themselves from Jews was to do so in a binary way. If God had chosen the Jewish people, and that people was God's favorite people, and God was speaking particularly to that people, what then happened after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE? Well, God clearly decided the Jews were not following God's way, and God's promise continues through the new Israel, as Christians understood themselves to be. This doctrine of supersessionism understood that God had now rejected the Jews and continued God's promise through Christianity. Therefore, everything good is associated with Christianity, everything evil associated not only on anyone who behaved differently, but particularly on Jews who could have followed Jesus and seen Jesus as Mashiach and choose stubbornly not to do so. This denigration and demonizing got embodied in sacred text, but you can see here that it began as a difference of opinion among Jews, but within a few centuries, Christians, by then they were Christians, in church reading the Gospels would not have known that. They would simply have seen all of these negative connotations, these disparaging remarks, these vicious and venomous critiques of everything they stood for, because once the other church writings build on this, the rhetoric gets much more invidious. They would have seen this as applying to the Jews they knew in the, let's say, the 3rd century or the 4th century, not understanding that what had been an intra-Jewish argument was now this binary where all the negative was deflected on the Jews. I'm just going to point out to you the last point here from chapter 27. Chapter 27, verse 25, you will see this is the passage in Matthew where you can see the charge of deicide as being leveled against the Jews, right? Pontius Pilate washed his hands of the death of Jesus. I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. And all the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. And that, again, was interpreted later on as understanding Jews as being responsible for the death of Jesus, or to Christians for the death of their Lord, death of God in a way. So the bottom line, as we finish looking at the ancient period, and then we'll stop and take a few questions, is that words matter. This is the rhetoric of invidious contrast. Polemics were not necessarily or primarily against Jews and Judaism, but rather as a way of reinforcing the early Christian community's identity. But that understanding got lost, and what we had left was the rhetoric in the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, state and church intertwined, setting the stage for tragedy when it was not only words attacking Jews, but physical attacks as well. Happy to take a few questions.
Leonard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Doesn't this continue on in early Christianity itself? David Nierenberg, in his book on anti-Judaism, points out that St. Jerome and St. Augustine accused each other of Judaizing. And so the need to extirpate anything Jewish from within the Christian world continued, and the Jewish versus non-Jewish conflict persisted throughout the early Christian church, didn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, and we are now going to see exactly how devastating that could be. Thank you.
Paul Adam?
Yes. Hi. Thank you. You got my name and my first name. Thank you, Paul Adam. Yes. Hi. Shavuot Tov. I guess, well, 2 questions. You don't have to answer the second one per se now, but the first one is, I was laughing when I heard you reading the Matthew, the Gospel, mainly because I was thinking, that's gonna be skewed to the fathers and to the Pope's advantages eventually. When did it become more or less of Matthew critiquing the Pharisees and more of the Pope saying, "Oh, go ahead, kill anyone that you see as like Jewish"? When did that become like completely skewed?
Stay tuned. I'm going to try to do the whole rest of the historical timeline and the rest of the time we have left.
Neil?
Hi, thank you. So when I presented some of this stuff, because I actually studied New Testament as a religion major in college, and I'm very involved with interfaith, I will sometimes say that looking at the New Testament at face value, it almost looks like they were criticizing, and Jesus himself criticizing particularly Sadducees rather than Pharisees, but the reason that it got switched to Pharisees is that with the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees were essentially out of business, and the Pharisees, as the remaining group that could bring Judaism into the new millennium, that they therefore, as you were saying, Doctor, basically became the enemy. I think of the Pharisees as, like kind of like the Hasidim. They're the ones who were the good guys because they figured out how to redo sacrificial Judaism without a temple and make it into what we have now. But from a Christian perspective, trying to establish Christianity, they became the bogeymen because that's, as you were implying, it's like the differentiation between nascent Christianity and Judaism in transition. Am I like barking up the right tree on both sides of that it was probably originally anti-Sadducee and that it was switched to Pharisees to differentiate?
Well, if you think of it, as the, let's say the early followers of Jesus, the Matthew followers of Jesus, let's just say, certainly they had critiques against the temple cult, but those are critiques they shared with the Pharisees. So another way of thinking about them is to say they were Pharisees. But as you know, as a religious leader yourself, no Jewish community is monolithic. We have enough differences of opinion amongst ourselves as there are Jews. So you're going to have amongst the Pharisees differences of opinion about what is this kind of Judaism that they're trying to cultivate. And it's out of that, so that in a way, the early Christians are even more intimately involved as Jews than conventional wisdom would have it. They are concerned Jews. They want to get it right. Just as those early Pharisees, or whatever we might call them at the time, who did not feel that Jesus was Mashiach, but who otherwise shared a lot of the same opinions and differed in other ways from these early followers of Jesus.
Phyllis?
I'd like to just go back to that quote you said, his blood is on us and our children. It sounds almost like a soundbite to be used in a political campaign. I mean, it's, you know, so I don't have the source material, but was that Matthew blaming his group for the death of Jesus? And why did he say that? I didn't quite
No, it
understand.
is the people saying that. So the question then is, who are the people? And it became pretty easy, given all of this what becomes anti-Jewish rhetoric, for all the people to be synonymous with Jews. And since it's on us and on our children, it's Jews forever, until Vatican II.
Bob?
Yes, the question, hi, Shuly.
Hi, Bob.
The question is, I'm not an expert in the New Testament, but is Matthew the only one of the Gospels where this statement is made, where the people accept it upon themselves and their children?
Yes.
And if
It's
so,
only
so
in Matthew.
what's the dynamic between Matthew as a book and the others that have parallel stories without this statement? And
So obviously, it is not so clear that what happened, and there are different accounts in the different Gospels. They're each kind of whatever. They each have their own unique characteristics. But look, there's so much about that we don't know about what actually happened in the life of Jesus. Even the Gospels were written a generation later. Some of them, let alone John, which is even later. So, just as we think of Hamisha Humshei Torah, right? This is not a historical book. These are accounts of the life of Jesus to, miracle stories, etc. There's, I would say there's a lot of midrash here in the Gospels. So they are not written to be a historical account.
Stephen? Stephen, we'll unmute you, okay?
Professor, how would you define the Pharisees? Who were they?
Oh, that's a topic for a different class. I would say that my colleagues who are more expert in this than I would not be able to give you a simple definition.
Sherry?
Yeah, it's interesting what you said before about one generation perhaps understanding what was being said at that point, but the later generations took it a totally different way, irrespective of what the causes were. Now, I see the same thing now happening when someone in a, I'm not trying to be nasty about it, but someone in a Reform synagogue, the rabbi, preaching about those Torah true Jews. In other words, referring to Orthodoxy in a degrading fashion. Now, we may understand where that viewpoint comes from, but do the, let's say, the children and the grandchildren understand where those words come from. They just see it as really abasing all Jews in a kind of sense.
Right. So yes, there misunderstandings arise all the time with text, and that's precisely what we're seeing here. I'm seeing a lot more questions, but I'm mindful of the time. So I think that we're gonna move on, and hopefully we'll have a little time for questions later on or at the end. So if we look at, as I said, at the consequences of this rhetoric in the Middle Ages, I think the simplest way to do that is to look at the second document that I have here, which is reproducing two fairly large statues, but statues that were very common in the Middle Ages. They often were found on the portal of cathedrals in Europe. And these two that you see here on the left, the large woman with holding the cross is ecclesia, representing the church, and the woman on the right representing synagoga. You would find this also sometimes on in a crucifixion scene. You would see this painted on either side of the cross in a crucifixion scene. Any of you who've done art history know how important art and iconography were, particularly in the Middle Ages, and in an era when most men and women were not literate of depicting theology through art. And that is exactly the theology of supersessionism depicted through art. Why? Ecclesia is standing upright, looking upright, with a crown on her head, with the looking forward. She's holding the chalice in her hand, which symbolizes the Holy Communion and the blood shed by Jesus on the cross. If you look on the right, synagoga, her pair, synagoga is blindfolded, looking downward, forlorn. Why is she blindfolded? Because she refuses to see the truth of Christ. It's a little hard to see, but in her right hand, she has a broken lance that she's holding. In her left hand, you see the tablets of the law, right? Aseret HaDibrot, slipping from her hand. This depicts what I mentioned before, this doctrine of supersessionism. God has rejected the Jews. Yeah, they're still around, but if Jews are going to be around in the Middle Ages, it better be obvious that they are second class, that they are in a forlorn state, because we need to make it clear that God's promise continues through Christianity. So by the 11th century, you have the First Crusades, 1096, and you know, some Christians figure, well, what do we need to go all the way to Palestine to kill infidels and secure our place in heaven? We have Jews here, and gee, we may even owe them some money. So, and you have Jews who were murdered in the 11th century. We have chronicles that depict this. And it was the beginning of a turning point. Until that point, despite all of this really vicious rhetoric on the part of certain church leaders, Jews and Christians got along just fine. They had deep social ties with each other. They had economic ties. There's evidence, for example, of Christian midwives delivering Jewish babies. That's a pretty intimate moment. Jews would not have Christians in their homes in that particular for that particular task unless they trusted each other and felt comfortable living together. They also shared a lot of religious language, martyrdom, exegesis, scholasticism, and yet you begin to see this the negative rhetoric beginning to have deadly consequences. This becomes even worse in the 12th century, and the next thing, item number 3, if you turn to that, you can see a lithograph. Again, this is just one of so many different kinds of depictions of what, beginning in 1144, came to be known as the blood libel, as a ritual murder charge against Jews, the allegation that Jews used Christian children's blood to make matzah. If you look at this, it is a pretty evocative image. You know that all of the individuals are Jews because you'll see a circular patch on their garments. For many of them, you will also see a money bag hanging from their belts. You'll see their long noses. So you're beginning to see some of the anti-Semitic iconography, some of the tropes. Already by the 15th century, no one needs any words for it to be obvious that these are Jews. The child that they are sacrificing, to state the obvious, this is a adult-like child held up as if he is Christ on the cross. The knife is pointing at his penis. So in the very organ that defines a male child as a Jew, that is where the lithograph is depicting the drawing of blood. And you even see someone else pricking the child's arm with a nail. So there's also an allusion to the nailing of Christ to the cross. And they basin at the bottom to capture that blood. Thousands of Jews were killed as a result of these absolutely false accusations. In Strasbourg, the very same city where the ecclesia and synagogue that we just saw were seen on the portal of the cathedral, 2,000 Jews lost their lives. This then continued, and I think the most, the one that rings most true today is in the 14th century during the Black Death. 60% of Europeans' population died. No one understood the cause of this terrifying death, of this terrifying disease. So by this point, when society needs a scapegoat, there's an obvious scapegoat. Everyone sees it. They see it every time they go through the town square and they look up at the cathedral. In addition to the ecclesia and synagogue, there were depictions of Jews as pigs, again, sculpted into the churches in Europe at the time. So Jews, who are the most obvious outsiders in a Europe that was pretty monolithically Christian at the time, Jews were blamed for causing the Black Death. They were blamed for, accused of poisoning the wells. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed. So this is a direct tie to what I began with, right? The way that Jews are being blamed for the coronavirus. Thank God, without the deadly consequences we see in the 14th century. But if you think of the level of superstition, of misinformation, of illiteracy and ignorance at the time, people were hungry for a scapegoat, and Jews become that scapegoat. If we pivot now to modernity, what happens in modernity is that all of these anti-Semitic tropes, which some of which we saw already in the book of Matthew, and more of which we see building in the Middle Ages, these now become transformed in a secular setting. If in the medieval period, Christian society was trying to figure out either why are Jews still alive if God abandoned them, or if they're here, what are we supposed to do with them? And how do we relate to Jews? This then becomes not a question of Jews as an entity, but rather of individual Jews. In modernity, of course, the singular feature of modernity is that individuals gained rights as individuals, not as members of a class or a caste. And the question then became what was clearly named as the Jewish question: is there a place for a Jew in modern Europe? Is there a place for a Jew as a member of a nation? Can a Jew be a Frenchman? Was the famous question that Napoleon asked. Or will Jews always be loyal to some other country? Can Jews be trusted? Or the whole conspiracy theories of the protocols, right? Are they really only out for themselves? Can Jews fit into European society because actually they are racially inferior, right? By the end of the 19th century, the nationalist anti-Semitism, the economic anti-Semitism against Jews as communists, Karl Marx, etc., socialists, right? Then you begin to see Jews as the quintessential conspiracists. All of this builds. And even when Jews were emancipated, that is, given individual rights in Europe, what became clear by the end of the 19th century, in 1895, during the Dreyfus Affair, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a captain in the French army, was accused and convicted of treason, again, with completely false evidence. He was found guilty of espionage, and the crowd didn't shout, "Death to Dreyfus." The crowd shouted, "Death to the Jews." So even an assimilated Jew who had proudly owned his identity as a French Jew, joined the army, risen to the rank of captain, all of that proved meaningless and left Jews vulnerable at the end of the 19th century in ways that were different from what we saw in the Middle Ages and different from what we saw in the first century. But what we see here is that anti-Semitism builds upon itself, because each of the stereotypes, each of the tropes accusing Jews in various modes and various settings can rear its head again whenever society is vulnerable, whenever society is unstable, and whenever society or individuals in it are looking for a scapegoat. One of the questions we Americans often ask ourselves is America different? And of course, like any good Jewish answer, the answer is yes and no, right? In some ways, America is different in terms of the experience of Jews in this country. Why? The United States does not have that medieval baggage. The United States was founded on with a Bill of Rights that codified the separation of church and state. And the United States, unlike any of the European countries, was a country in which Jews never had to struggle for emancipation. Jews earned their rights as Americans the same way every American earned those rights as a result of the Constitution of the United States. Unlike in France, for example, when the Declaration of the Rights of Men in 1789 turned out didn't actually include Jews, and they needed two separate decrees of emancipation in 1790 and 1791. Why two, you may ask? The Sephardim were emancipated first because they were more assimilated. So it was, I guess, more palatable to emancipate them first. And then the Ashkenazim, who were much more traditional Jews in Eastern France, were emancipated a year later. In the United States, there is no document emancipating the Jews. The Jews are emancipated as any American was granted citizenship. And to our lasting benefit, the word Jew does not appear in the United States Constitution. On the other hand, of course, the United States was founded by immigrants who came from Europe, Christians. And so some of those anti-Semitic tropes were embedded in the psyche of our founders. And we understand that despite the official separation of church and state, we all understand that this is a Christian country in many ways. We have seen periodic flare-ups of anti-Semitism in this country, although thank God, it is not state-sanctioned the way it was in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, and of course, in Germany. So just to give us a little bit of a taste of what we have experienced in the United States, look at the fourth text. And this is something that was written by Henry Ford. As we know, Henry Ford was an industrialist who revolutionized the assembly line for the automobile. He was one of the most famous Americans. He was very philanthropic. He was also a deep, deep anti-Semite. And he supported the Dearborn Independent, which was an anti-Semitic newspaper, and a number of anti-Semitic pamphlets. Hitler was influenced by his rhetoric, and he received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle by Hitler in 1938. This is just one excerpt, and I'm going to read a little bit of it here for you. About 8 months ago, the Dearborn Independent began a series of studies on the Jewish question. It was an attempt to state the facts on which the question is based. It was not at its beginning, nor has it since developed into an attack on Jews as Jews. Its purpose was enlightenment. I'm skipping now to the third paragraph. Jews are the best organized people in the United States. They are more closely grouped together in their own national interest than are the citizens of the United States, whose whole nationality is defined by their citizenship. Okay, that is the anti-Semitic trope of clannishness, that Jews are clannish. The end of that paragraph, telegraphic speed and instantaneous mass action have marked every move organized Jewry has made in this country in the last 6 months. The next paragraph, they control the avenues of communication in this country. Sound familiar? Jews control the media. They can mobilize quickly. At the end of that paragraph, they are a separate people within the American people, a people that do not agree with the genius of the American people, and a people that constantly make distinction between Jewish and American rights. They are a separate people. Sound like the book of Esther? Again, we see these anti-Semitic tropes continuing. And then the conspiracy theory in the next paragraph. Jewish solidarity would be above criticism were it used for the benefit of the whole communal life. But it is not. It is not only Jewish, but its operations show it to be largely anti-American. It opposes many things that have been conceded to constitute the American tradition. The Jew assumes that the United States is still an unformed entity, which is fair prey to anyone who can seize it and mold it. He adopts the belief that part of his duty is to bring America into being on Jewish lines. So you see, these attacks amplified old tropes and laid the groundwork for things that we heard in Charlottesville 3 years ago, right? That we see on Twitter and in right-wing news organizations today. So someone asked before, what was the how did we get from Matthew to what happens today? You see in this rhetoric what Hitler could build upon and then amplify, obviously, a thousandfold in Nazi Germany to catastrophic outcome. We then see a lot of this gets embedded in the Muslim world, in part through the spread of Christianity in the Ottoman Empire in the era of colonization, and it found receptive ears. The protocols of the Elders of Zion were popularized in the Muslim world after 1948, and the next step of that then becomes anti-Zionism, where it is, in a way, it's a contemporary way of thinking about medieval anti-Semitism, right? Where in the medieval period, Jews as a group were demonized as a whole. Here you have anti-Zionists, right? Anything having to do, any Jew is by definition an that Zionism is the new racism, and that it's imperialist, colonialist, it's discriminatory, and therefore must be combated. And the blurring of distinction between Jew and Israeli, Jew and Zionist, Judaism and Zionism all becomes blurred and embedded as these tropes take hold. Okay, maybe we can take just a few questions now before we bring us up to today.
Tony? Oh.
Hello?
Steve?
Yes. You mentioned that Jews didn't need emancipation in the United States and they were never less than citizens. But I wonder if you would comment on the role of George Washington's letter to the Jewish community and the impact that might have had some other president gone in some other direction with that statement.
Yes, so thank you for bringing that up. A beautiful letter. I think that you're pointing up what has always been such an issue, and that, you know, emancipation takes many different, has many different aspects to it. And in part, emancipation is about political and civil rights. But part of emancipation is social emancipation, feeling that you belong. And I would say that that letter by George Washington went such a long way to help the Jewish community feel comfortable and secure. Look, they already felt that they wanted to stake their claim as Americans here because they wrote the letter first to him, right? Other religious groups were writing to Washington to congratulate him, and the Jewish community did as well. But his response was so validating to Jews, and you know, there was a lot of philo-Semitism among the early founding fathers. So that's what you see reflected in that dynamic. Thanks.
Tony?
Hi, I'm a journalist and I divide my time between New York City and Paris. I'm always surprised that people are surprised that anti-Semitism is again a force in society. Given our history, why would anybody think anything else? It was the immediate post-Shoah period that was the anomaly, and now it's just business as usual.
You're so right. But as a journalist, you surely know that people's memories are very short. And the 75 years since the Shoah, it seemed like forever. And we were so accepted in Jewish life. Think of the depictions of Jews in the media. Jews became quintessential Americans on TV shows and movies, etc. It seemed like we were in a golden age that was only going to get better and better and better. But yes, anyone with a historical sensibility could never have reached a conclusion like that, although we can hope.
Lois?
Yes, I wanted to know, and maybe it's premature, maybe you're coming to it next, but what do you say to your interfaith colleagues in discussions about Matthew?
Thank you. Thank you for asking this. It gives me an opportunity to give a shout out to my friend and colleague, Professor Mary Boyes at Union Theological Seminary, a Catholic nun, with whom I have been teaching a course on Jewish-Christian relations at the Jewish Theological Seminary and at Union Theological Seminary. And so many of the insights that I have learned at her feet. And I think that I am doing my small part. She really has been a giant in the area of Jewish-Catholic relations. And together we hope that by teaching these texts in their true context to individuals, many of whom will be clergy, Jewish and Christian clergy, that we will, one clergy at a time, begin to help change that narrative. If we hope that everyone who takes our class, they will never give the same kinds of homilies or sermons again that they might otherwise have given before they had been able to look in new ways at these old texts. I'll take one more question and then I want to make sure we finish.
Michael?
Do you work with Muslim clergy?
I do in a less formal sense. I think as you have seen in the way that I have presented this, because Christianity emerges from first century whatever proto-Judaism, that relationship is the crucial one for the beginnings of anti-Semitism. Muslim anti-Semitism is a later development, and as I said, much of it is impacted by the centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. So certainly today, I think that what we are modeling begins with Jews and Christians, but ought not to end there. And so, you know, we're hopeful for that, and any opportunity for that is something I would seize. So I don't like to end without completing my thought here. So let's look at Christianity today. And what I would like to do, and this was the possibility end of the crisis and possibility, is to look at the last image, and this is a reimagined ecclesia and synagogue, which now graces the campus of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. It was commissioned, completed in 2015. It was commissioned to mark the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, in which Pope John the 23rd signaled a real change in in Catholic attitude towards the Jews, particularly, as I mentioned, on the charge of deicide, but also in other ways as well, and really inaugurated an era of Catholic Jewish relations, which has evolved in dramatic ways during that period of time. And so if you look at it, and you know, if you have both both documents together, you can look at them together. The second, you know, the image of Ecclesia Synagoga from the Strasbourg Cathedral, and the one from 2015, St. Joseph's University. They are, I will say what you can all see. They are equal. They are both wearing crowns. They both have crowns on their head. Their dress is equal. They are on equal footing. They are facing each other. Each has their sacred text ready to share with each other, to teach and to learn from one another. But they are still distinct. If you look at the way their feet are positioned, when they are finished, they will stand up and walk on their own path. So it's not a homogenization of religion, but it is depicting, it is a very clear depiction of a Christianity that has rejected the supersessionist claim, that it is not claiming that Christians are higher, they're better, they're correct, but rather that religious truth can come from Judaism and can come from Christianity, that we can learn from one another, that we ought to learn from one another, and that hopefully each religion is can be strengthened in its own resolve as a result of the insights that it gains from learning with the other, rather than feeling threatened by that kind of learning. So I find that sculpture very meaningful. My friend and colleague, Mary, whom I just mentioned, she commissioned another ecclesia and synagogue to mark that moment. Hers is it's metal sculptures. The ecclesia and synagogue are standing, and but similarly, one is holding a Torah, the other is holding the scrolls, and again, depicting in artistic form the rejection of supersessionism and the desire for dialogue on an equal footing. So, as we see, Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular has made huge strides in coming to terms with its role in fomenting anti-Semitism through the ages. There's no question that the Shoah and the recognition of Christian culpability in the development of this anti-Semitic rhetoric was the catalyst for this soul searching on the part of the church. I would say that it will be a slow process, because liturgy needs to change, exegesis needs to change, scholarship has changed already dramatically, but how does that scholarship make it down to the pews? So what we are seeing here is that, in my mind, so much of anti-Semitism has been built upon a false narrative of the early years of what becomes Judaism and what becomes Christianity. And just as in our own day, falsities must be corrected. They cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged. So too must we do this work. We have seen the extent to which the fake news that we see in things like the Book of Matthew and many, many other writings by church fathers, that fake news, when it becomes accepted truth, and I mean accepted to the extent that no one even thinks about it. This is what the Gospels say. It becomes clear that the Gospels are talking about Jews. There's no hint of a reason to question it. When it becomes accepted truth to this extent, it can have tragic consequences. We also know that as society has evolved throughout the era, scapegoats remain, and that Christian anti-Jewish tropes can be readily updated and adapted to new concerns about who belongs and who doesn't, who merits God's blessing and who doesn't. So, yes, is there anti-Semitism in the United States, just as there's anti-Semitism in every corner of the globe? Yes. But thankfully, as this Ecclesia and Synagoga from 2015 demonstrates, it also has a history of Jews and Christians building bridges, of especially post-Vatican II. I'll never forget, after the Pittsburgh massacre, I turned on my phone after Shabbat, and the first text I got was from my friend Mary Boyes, the Catholic nun, who was heartbroken and wanted to express her pain at the pain she knew that I was feeling. As I'm sure many of you experienced as well, Christians and Muslims joined us in our synagogues to show support, and some raised money as allies. So I would end by saying that I hope that we and our allies continue to call out vicious falsehoods whenever we see them, write new interpretations, liturgies, theologies that can change minds and capture hearts. And may we all live to see the appreciation of the dignity of all humankind and a recognition that truths need not be monolithic to be cherished, respected, and held close. I thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Professor Schwartz. I have my video back now. Can I close with one question of my own for you?
Please.
The protest movements that are the reopen protests that are happening right now, when I see those images, it seems culturally similar to me to Charlottesville. I wonder if you see connections there. Absolutely.
I mean, I see, look, I think you know, we think we're so advanced, but it's not unlike the terror during the Black Death. We can't get a handle on the coronavirus. We don't know what's going to be. There's no cure in sight. Individuals have been self-quarantining for several months, and the economic devastation is just beginning to sink in, and it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. So when you're terrified and you have no control, you want to blame somebody, right? So sadly, our country is so horribly polarized that the visible symbol of the pain is whatever, the governor, the mayor, whoever. It's easy to blame as if they're standing in the way of my economic livelihood. And, you know, they're the willful blindness to the facts is painful to watch, because it's not the mayor's fault, it's not the governor's fault. It is this virus that is attacking human beings, not Democrats or Republicans or lefties or righties, whatever.
It's really consistent with this 2,000-year trend that you've been teaching us about. Thank you so much for this wonderful class. It's kind of bringing together all of the history with the present moment. So really appreciate your teaching today. And I want to thank everyone for joining, and make sure you know that, that we're off for Memorial Day next Monday. To the extent that Memorial Day is different from any other day, because I'm not sure, but in case there are parents of kids off from school, we decided to take that day off. So we will see you again on June 1st, and our teacher that day will be Ruth Messenger, speaking about immigration crises today and historically for the Jewish people. So we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all. Nice to see everybody.